Welcome to This Old Democracy, a regular podcast where we explore the ideas, people, and movements working to rescue our faltering political system and rebuild American democracy on a stronger, more inclusive, and more representative foundation. I'm your host, Micah Sifry, and I've been on this beat for a long time, working to tackle the problem of big money in politics, writing a book about third parties in American politics, tracking how the internet has been shaking up the entire system, and more recently joining the fight against rising authoritarianism. This podcast is produced in partnership with the Center for Ballot Freedom, which is a cross partisan nonprofit dedicated to strengthening democracy. This is our fourth episode, and we've got plenty more coming. But now that we're getting our sea legs, we'd love your feedback on how we're doing. You can write us at info@centerforballotfreedom.org and put the word podcast in the subject line. And that information will also be in the show notes. Today, we're talking with Astra Taylor, a renowned author, documentarian, and organizer. Welcome, Astra, to This Old Democracy.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I've got a pile of your books next to me right here, and it's almost scary how far and wide you've ranged, how often you've been ahead of the curve from, for example, 2014, when you wrote your book, The People's Platform, Taking Back Power and Culture in the Digital Age. And you quite astutely argued then that the new world of social media was actually not democratizing society, but probably more just enriching and empowering a new class of oligarchs. To your most recent book, Solidarity, the Past, Present, and Future of a World-Changing Idea, which you wrote with Leah Hunt Hendricks, and which explores what it might be like if we valued each other as people and not just as commodities. And quite honestly, we could do a whole series of podcasts on all the ideas in these books. But the one that made me think that we really needed to invite you onto This Old Democracy is your 2019 book, Democracy May Not Exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. And the title slyly hints at the paradox at the heart of the book, if I'm reading it correctly, Astra, that you're saying that we've never really fully experienced democracy, but as Václav Havel, for example, memorably put it, it's not a thing you can achieve, but it's something that it's like a goal or horizon that you strive to approach, and that most of us would even struggle to define what democracy is, but that we're also pretty capable of understanding the absence of democracy and why we wouldn't want to live under such conditions. Is that a fair summary of what you were trying to do with the Democracy May Not Exist?
Yeah, thank you for that really generous and kind introduction. And you too have been on so many of these intersecting beats for a while, so I'm really honored to be here with you.
Mm.
And to me, the I really like the title of that book, right? I think it
Mhm.
does kind of convey where we're at, and where we were when I was writing it, 2015, 2016,
Mhm.
2017. Democracy may not exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. It's not something we have. So when people speak of our democracy, I always kind of, get my back up a little bit. It's something we're working towards. It's a process. It's a verb.
Yeah.
And it is this horizon, I think, that is always, sort of down the road. But, the thing is, democracy also, we don't just make progress towards that horizon. Things
Mhm.
can go into reverse. There can be democratic backsliding.
Yeah.
And that's certainly, something I was very worried about, which is why I emphasize that paradox. And it's something we are living through in an even more intense way. I also wanted to get at that paradox because, I'm proudly of the left.
Mhm.
And people often, in the camps, in the worlds that I am active in through my organizing and some of the sort of political ideas I've been shaped by, point out all the flaws of our democracy, the way it,
Mm.
it is captured by corporate interests, the way it's not representative, and the way it has always been sort of flawed from its inception. Speaking as someone who's in the United States, that is true, but also precious, fragile democratic progress has been made. And we need
Mm.
to really hold on to that and and
Mhm.
and prevent backsliding when we can. And I think sometimes we're born in a moment when we can move the ball forward and
Yeah.
achieve the sort of next step in the democratic march. And then sometimes I think our task is to try to hold the line so that at some future point, progress can be made. So I wanted to just kind of also push back on some folks and say, yeah, we need to be both at the same time. We need to be sort of critical and imaginative and think about how our democracy could be better, and what its flaws are, but also we need to honor, um, this experiment and its
Mm. Mhm.
fragility
Yeah,
and work to
for
protect
sure,
it.
for sure. I mean, and, I had Perry Bacon on, uh, a few weeks ago, um, talking about the same general area, and, I mean, uh, you could argue that America wasn't even close to being a democracy until the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and that finally all of our citizens could have a meaningful opportunity to participate in the process. And that was just what, 1965. So, barely 70, no, 60 years ago. Um, we are in a different moment. When you wrote the book, it was a few years into the first term of Donald Trump. And for argument's sake, at least then, our ability to push back on authoritarian power grabs was more robust, not just the midterm election of 2018, but there was a lot more, I would say, resilience and guardrails. As we look at today, where do you think things stand now? And in that, and also, what has surprised you most about the first 6 months of the second term?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I want to say I love Perry and
Mm.
Perry's work. It's, really insightful. And I just want to linger on what you said though, which is that we really haven't been a multiracial democracy or a feminist approaching feminist democracy for very long. So it's not our old democracy, it's our new democracy in a
Mm,
sense.
mm,
And
mm,
Um, and I think that's really important to underscore that, some of the things many of us take for granted as being synonymous with the word democracy are very new and newly won and really did have to be fought for. So, that can be kind of humbling how recent this
mm,
experiment is.
mhm,
The truth is what got me on the path of writing this book was actually my engagement with Occupy Wall Street, which started in 2011. And so that was a moment of crisis, right? The financial crisis and a moment when sort of the public started thinking about economic issues and economic inequality and the corruption of our political system by concentrated wealth.
mhm,
So, the rallying cry of Occupy Wall Street was banks got bailed out, we got sold out. And I started thinking about, whether we had a democracy, whether we were living in an oligarchy in that moment, and wrestling with the paradoxes of democracy. So the book you mentioned, each chapter is a paradox, a kind of tension that I
mhm,
think is eternally at the heart of democracy, because democracy is not easy. It's actually built on these tensions. How do we balance freedom and equality? How do we balance inclusion and exclusion? How do we balance the needs of the present with those of the future? How do we balance the global with the local? These are things that are irresolvable. They're actually eternal tensions in this
mhm,
democratic process. Um, so I could feel that populist current, right? That frustration with elites in that moment of Occupy Wall Street. And so, Occupy was also came on the heels of the Tea Party movement.
right.
The Tea Party started in 2009, then
Mhm,
Occupy 2011. So I was not surprised that there was a right-wing populist insurgency when Trump was, um, uh, gaining momentum. I was optimistic that he would lose, but it
yeah.
wasn't surprising to me that that was a political force. And in fact, if you go back, to read your Plato and you go back to read The Republic, which is
Mm,
one of the early criticisms of democracy, he says basically when wealth inequality spirals and when people are driven into debt, because they can't afford their basic needs, a demagogue will arise,
Hmm.
and speak to that. And so Trump sort of fit this, longstanding formula, right? The formula of the
Hmm.
demagogue. Um, and so as I started to go around and research this book, I that I think was my moment of shock because I was talking to young people who were attracted to the right, and what they said really chilled me. I'd come of age against Ronald Reagan, right? The sort of
Yeah,
in '80s and
me too.
'90s when capitalism and democracy are married. They're the
Hmm.
best friends. They're against, communist equality. These kids were not echoing that talking point. They were saying, "We want capitalism. Democracy doesn't work."
Hmm.
And we are choosing a side. We're choosing, the side of inequality. Democracy is getting in the way of our goals and our ascension. And this was very shocking to me to hear this from the mouths of 18, 19, 20-year olds.
Yeah.
And that I think is far less of a shock in this moment when we're seeing overt authoritarianism, when we are seeing these anti-democratic forces. So, I would be lying if I said, "Oh, nothing in the second Trump administration has shocked me." I think, but it when I went and sort of encountered those anti-democratic currents,
Mm.
up close in my reporting and just, on a college campus in North Carolina or
Mm.
on the streets of Florida, that for me was the moment of sort of my jaw dropping because
Uh,
it seemed very sort of anti-American to me, right?
mhm. Yeah.
That the right wing was letting go of the idea of democracy so explicitly, or the fig leaf of it, the cover of it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it was being even used in a sort of instrumental rhetorical way, but to just say we don't even need that fig leaf anymore, was shocking. So I think uh, I think we're seeing that manifest in this administration, and we're seeing people who have developed a philosophy of power and authoritarianism that justifies their actions,
Mhm.
um, and they're going for it.
Well, that's interesting. What you're saying about the shift, particularly among young people. Um, I mean, the youth vote is never as big as older people voting, though
Mhm.
Zoran Mamdani's recent success being sort of the one interesting exception at the moment. But the way that when I look at who's showing up right now in opposition to the authoritarian thrust of the second term, which is absolutely way more unshackled and dangerous.
Mhm.
Um, you know, it's mostly older people. It's mostly people who, even people who can remember World War II, right?
Mhm.
Or at least heard, took those stories in from their parents about what fascism really was. And the younger generation obviously has no knowledge of that. If anything, we're talking about people who maybe their experience of democracy is extremely negative, like it's gridlock, it's corruption, it's, as you said, the banks get bailed out and ordinary people don't get much help. And so you can kind of understand where that desire for let's just blow it up and give me the free market instead, and maybe that this just has to run its own course. I, you know, uh, I mean, you and Naomi Klein wrote a very depressing, very powerful article in the Guardian a couple months ago. We'll put the link in that to that in the show notes, called "The Rise of End Times Fascism." End times being this sense of we're headed towards the apocalypse, and only the virtuous white Christian fundamentalist folks are the ones we care about making sure they survive. um, and you tied a lot of threads together, which also end times being the way the climate crisis just keeps getting worse and worse, and now we have an administration that kind of wants to go full speed ahead in making it even worse. How do we fight that? I mean, what's your I know you're writing a book about that article now. How do we fight end times fascism if that's really what we're dealing with.
Yeah, actually, when you said, "Oh, you've been prescient," I was like, "I hope I'm not prescient now."
Yeah.
Actually, with this
Well,
turn.
Cassandra is sometimes right. Yeah.
Yeah, well, the parable of Cassandra is chilling in that Cassandra
Yeah.
was not,
Not
listened
listened to. Yeah.
So, I and you've been on this train as well, one of the things that I think people like us who push the idea of organizing are always trying to convey is that it's not enough just to have sort of public opinion on our side. It's not enough to
Mhm.
just have um, good polling that supports the
Yeah.
popularity of the policies we want to see. We have to build institutional power. So these young people I was interviewing back in 2015 who were very right leaning and anti-democratic, they weren't the majority of their generational cohort, but they
No.
were tapped into a very organized and well-financed
Mm.
movement, right? I
Mhm.
mean, these were the kinds of kids who were going to maybe join Turning Point USA and
Right.
maybe get an internship at, a law firm and be sort of welcomed into a network of organizations with a clear political mission.
Mhm.
Um, and this has been, something, philosophers, political philosophers have marveled over forever. It's like, how is it that the many are controlled by the few? Well, how is this possible? Well, and it's possible because we have to act, we act through institutions. We have to create social blocks that can exert political force. So I think, how do we fight end times fascism? I mean, we desperately need to get better organized. And
Mhm.
that's why, alongside writing, I have worked to build the Debt Collective, which is the
Mhm.
world's first union of debtors. We were, very instrumental in the fight for student loan abolition under the Biden administration. And it's an experiment. It's an experiment in how do you align people around, a capacious, inclusive identity. In our case, the identity of being a debtor, of someone
Mhm.
who doesn't have enough money to meet their basic needs, just like labor unions organize people around the identity of being a worker, or tenants unions organize, or, a group like Indivisible organizes people around the
Yeah.
identity of being concerned about democracy.
Or the NRA organizes people around the identity of loving to, own and use guns.
Bingo,
Let's be real.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so, I think you mentioned my book on solidarity, and one of our messages there, Leah, my co-author, and I, is that solidarity it's not spontaneous. It has to be
Mhm.
organized.
Mhm.
And we can also create new identities, just as you said, the identity of the Second Amendment diehard, right? The identity of a debtor. So that is, I think that's on the most basic level, the answer, I mean, I think movements need to have different components to be successful. So, one is a kind of shared identity, ideally a capacious, inclusive one that broadens the constituency. You also have to, I think, have a strong vision worth
Mhm.
fighting. This is so on the democracy front, I think the Democrats were, looking backwards in their conception of democracy. We need to protect our democracy, protect the status quo. Well, that
Yeah.
didn't appeal to people in an election that where people were like, the status quo isn't working, right?
Right.
The Democratic Party became, and Steve Bannon, was crowing about this after Trump's victory. They became the party of defending the indefensible, defending a broken status quo, defending the oligarchy, defending systems that were not serving people. So we need a vision that is galvanizing, forward-looking, worth taking time out of your life to fight for. And I think that's part of how we bring youth back into
Mm.
movement. And that's Mamdani did that by saying, "Hey, let's fall in love with New York City together. Let's make New York City better, right? Let's have
Mm.
buses that actually are fast and free. Let's not just defend a reality that was difficult and unjust." So you need identity, you need vision, and then you need strategy. And that's where it's hard because we live in a complex political system and each issue needs a different strategy. Debtor organizing has a very specific kind of strategy. And democratic transformation in this country, given our electoral system and our legal regime and the fact of money in politics is, a big task, but we have to organize at the scale of the problem, and that's
Mhm.
that's what we have to do. There's no shortcuts.
Right. Well, I agree with everything that you're saying, but I really now want to drill on, as we sort of turn the corner and start to see uh, the last part of our conversation approach. You, all of the things that you say about organizing, that obviously individuals, the problems are too big for individuals to solve on their own. I can recycle all my newspaper and metal and plastic, and I am not going to stop global warming that way.
Yeah.
Um, the but politics, if politics is a team sport, right, and organizing is critical, the the problem, it seems to me, that I'd love to hear your answer is, what do you do when you're stuck inside this two-party duopoly? Because one party is clearly well captured now by a very dangerous faction, the end times fascism people, if you will, or MAGA.
Mhm.
And the other party is this kind of messy coalition that where there are multiple factions that are, there's you might say the moderate corporate faction, and then the more progressive, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren faction. And neither faction is strong enough to dominate.
Mm.
Um, the electoral math of winning power in Congress makes Democrats say, well, we have to worry about our frontline members who are like the most vulnerable, the most in need of, quote, moderation. And that frustrates, I think, young people, the young people who are not captured by, this ideology of rejecting democracy, who want the system to work for everybody, that we should be a multiracial democracy. So what is your answer there? I saw a little in the Democracy May Not Exist, where I didn't really see you and Leah take it up much in the Solidarity book. Organizing at scale, it seems to me, is something that fundamentally that's what political parties do,
Yeah.
right? I mean, healthy ones. Not saying we have healthy ones, but you know, you've traveled the world. You know that there are places where there are social democratic parties that actually have done a pretty good job of organizing and translating values into policies that change people's lives. So
Mm.
what do we do about that here? How do you think about that?
Yeah, well, this is such a big question, so I'm just gonna try to say a few, I mean, a few things that come to mind. I mean, one
Mm,
is that, I think for some folks, we still have to make the case that the Democratic Party is the vehicle
yeah,
for
yeah,
a small d democratic transformation, and I argue that it is because of the way, at this moment, our election landscape is structured legally.
right, right.
And, one way of saying you're describing the Democratic coalition, it's a kind of hollow party on some level.
Hmm.
I mean, I can just be a Democrat
Right.
by registering. And, what we saw on the right was, an extremist element capturing the party. I mean, one twisted benefit, I guess, of a two-party system is that if you can manage to capture one party, you've captured one of two parties,
That's
right?
right. That's right.
And that's the game we're in at the moment, I think. I think we have to try to contest to strengthen the progressive, faction within the Democratic Party and not give up on that, and not give up after, 1 or 2 elections that
Mm,
don't go our way. So I think, I think a fundamental thing we still have to convince folks who are in this camp you described of, being disappointed, of feeling like the status quo is broken, of feeling like the Democratic Party is captured by corporate interests, and to say to them, "You're not wrong,
yeah.
but this is still worth fighting for." I think one important, maybe it's not a strategic point, is that you know, we shouldn't be sanctimonious. I think that there's a kind of sanctimony sometimes that when we talk about elections where it's like, it's your moral duty to vote, right?
Yeah.
And I'm more of the mind that we should speak to people's cynicism. Like, you're right, the Democratic Party is captured by corporate interests, right? And that's so, we are fighting in some forces in the Democratic Party as much as we are fighting the right. And I think on a strategic level, it's better to acknowledge people's
Mm.
suspicions and cynicisms and heartbreak instead of trying to use a kind of sanctimonious approach to getting them to vote. Um, I also think it's important to put transformative changes on the horizon, again, to go into this issue of, like, not just defending the indefensible status quo, but to say fusion voting, ranked choice voting, proportional representation. There are other ways of structuring democracies. None of them are a panacea, right? We don't
Right.
it's not there are countries with proportional representation that are still pretty effed up, but
Yeah.
it would go a long way, for us. And I think, ranked choice voting has its critics, but I think what we saw in New York City with Brad Lander and Zoran Mamdani was the way that that structure for voting, where you could rank your choices,
Yeah.
enabled a solidarity between two candidates that
Yeah.
was actually didn't just lead to a political victory, but was actually sort of, I thought, just politically such an important transformative message in terms of where they were coming from. So I think the last thing I'll say on this front is there's a very popular position that is so obvious, and it's called money out of politics. When you
Yeah.
poll Americans and you say, "Do you want corporate money buying elections?" Republicans don't like it, independents don't like it, Democrats don't like it. And that is the I think if a movement could be built around that, and that was sort of what Occupy Wall Street was hinting at, right? Was
Sure.
right?
Having toiled in those fields years ago, when we were trying to pass public financing initiatives in a number of states, we got it through in Maine, Massachusetts, Arizona, and Citizens United has
Mhm.
kind of blown up, and the associated decision have kind of blown up that entire landscape, and the it's worse than I've ever in my lifetime. I mean, with Elon Musk sort of being at the apex of the richest man in the world for a while, literally buying himself a co-presidency,
Mhm.
um, and intimidating everybody else with his money. I mean, maybe we should chalk it up as a victory that the anti-Musk movement. That he had to eventually leave Washington with his tail between his legs. He lost in Wisconsin. His money turned out to be toxic. Um, so that's one thing that I think could give us some hope that we found a way, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
To sort of neutralize some of the power of money. I think look, I'm with you 100% on the all the things you're saying about pragmatically what people need to do in the current context. I think that the the value of a vision of what a better democracy would look like and feel like, which is more than just people marching in the street saying this is what democracy looks like, which I think bothers you as much as it
Yeah.
bothers me. Um, I mean, it's great, it's rhythmic, but
I
it's
my mind always my counter chant is always, "Is this what democracy
is
looks
this
like?"
what? Yeah,
We
no, God forbid that
yeah.
democracy looks like a mob in the streets. That can turn ugly if we're not careful. So the the idea that maybe we can innovate at the edges, um, and in the places where um, progressives maybe have a little bit of power show that you're doing things in a different and better way that make people feel more included, and that we tie that to something that is this effort uh, to make democracy something more than something we will miss.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like the current moment. We'll end on this thought because it's happening now. We're speaking on August 5th, early in August. This podcast will be probably out in a week. Um, we are seeing this something gigantic happen right now with this fight over redistricting in Texas. Um, I mean, the fact that the governor of New York, the governor of California, the governor of Illinois, they are all saying, "Oh yeah, if you're gonna break that norm, which is you only get to gerrymander once every 10 years, right,
Mhm.
and just cheat in the middle." Um,
Mhm.
to steal more seats in advance of next year's critical election, we're going to do the same thing. I feel like something is changed when the governors of Democratic states kind of just come out and say, okay, gloves are off. This is now war. I mean, does it feel different to you? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and from what I've looked at, these governors are outflanking some, kind of democracy defense groups,
The
right?
good government groups are being shoved to the side. Yeah.
The good government groups who, understandably like the idea of independent redistricting, but I think it's a moment we go, even independent redistricting in a political situation where the Senate is, disproportionate, where we
Yeah.
have the problem of money in politics, like, let's use this moment to, again, speak to people's rightful, uh, understandable criticisms of democracy and start talking about a bigger horizon. So I
Well,
think there's a huge opportunity here, and it's
uh,
and to push back even on this idea of independent, neutral redistricting as, the holy grail, because that's I don't think that's gonna cut it. And there's, I think there's potential to spark a sort of bigger, at least more imaginative conversation. But certainly this is a tipping point, right? And
yeah,
we are seeing a power grab that um is unprecedented,
right.
in this country.
And I think people sense, well, it's a big open question, right? Does our natural common sense feeling of fairness,
Mhm.
right? That the game has we're in a game, but it has to be played in on some fair basis.
Yeah,
Um, when one side breaks it so blatantly, and then the other side says, "Fine, we'll break it too." Um, that's new,
yeah.
and I think it's really dangerous. I mean, I'm hopeful. There's always a chance there'll be a mutual back down. But on the other hand, this may be another turn in the acceleration, the breakdown of our shared sense that we're in the same country, we operate under the same rules, and when you lose an election, you accept that you've lost. So,
Yes.
God help
Yeah, no,
us.
I agree. I share that fear, and I think that's why, this equal and opposite movement, I
Mm,
think then it's a race. It is kind of a race to the bottom, and I
yeah,
wonder how can we use that to say, okay, there's actually a more robust vision of democracy
mhm,
that isn't us just, rigging elections in to the advantage of our party, but a deeper transformation
right,
that gets to
right.
issues of political economy, that gets to issues of equality, that many people in the Democratic Party don't wanna talk about.
Well, it may be time for a new movement.
Yep.
Let's circle back in a couple of months and check in and see if maybe something emerges that can kind of be the container for that.
Well, and that's
Um,
what I think being a student of social movements across
mm,
time, you see that it's, good ideas, have to circulate again and again. People have to try again and again and lose over and over again, right? Until the moment presents itself where forces align. And so that's it's from studying history that I'm just so dogged,
yeah.
because there were lots of feminists before there was anything, resembling equality under the law.
Mm,
There were lots of people fighting for the abolition of slavery before the Emancipation Proclamation, let alone the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. So, you know, just banging your head against the wall over and over is just part of the job, and you try to and part of why solidarity matters is it's more fun when you're doing it with comrades than when you're doing
agree.
it.
I agree. I was going to ask you, like I have everybody else at the end of each show, what gives you hope, how you keep going, but you kind of sort of have answered that for
Yes,
me. Yeah.
that's it.
Yeah.
Head banging
Appreciate
with
you.
friends.
Yeah. Doing it with friends. I agree. Don't try and do this stuff alone. It's too hard.
Yep.
Totally agree. Well, thank you, Astra. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for all you've done, you're doing now and have done in the past and will do in the future.
Appreciate you. Well, that's it for this episode of This Old Democracy. If you found today's conversation thought provoking, please share it with a friend, leave us a review, subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about our work and our partners at the Center for Ballot Freedom, go to centerforballotfreedom.org. We'd also love your feedback on how this podcast is going, and you can write us at info@centerforballotfreedom.org and put the word podcast in the subject line. I'm Micah Sifry. I'm your host. I'll be back with more stories of the people and ideas that are fighting to renew, repair, and rebuild this old democracy because it's ours and it's worth saving. Thanks for listening. Stay engaged.